When the masses descended upon Wall Street in September of 2011, it was the first time the general public had heard of terms like income inequality and the 1% since the 1990s. The Great Recession was not only a stark reminder of the white-knuckled grip that financial institutions have on the global economy, but also how high above the rest of us the wealthiest individuals sit. Many began to question the fairness of our capitalist society, including economist Thomas Piketty. Thomas Piketty is a French economist and the author of the New York Times best-selling Capital in the 21st Century, a thorough analysis of income and wealth inequality in the world, specifically in the US and Europe. The purpose of the book was to evaluate the interaction between economic growth and wealth, and moreover the accumulation of capital. Using a wide range of data starting all the way back in the 18th century, Piketty condensed his findings into a simple equation: R is greater than G, where the rate of return on capital exceeds the rate of economic growth. Piketty argues that, inherently, capitalism allows wealth and capital to concentrate into a very small proportion of the population. According to his findings, income inequality was rampant throughout the Industrial Revolution all the way up to the First World War. Capital growth stabilized until the 1970s due to high taxes, inflation, and the damning effects of war. However, come 1970, the global economy very quickly returned to its pre-war state of gross inequality. By 2010, over 23% of global income was concentrated in the top percentile in the US alone, with similar numbers for the rest of the world. In the US and in Europe, the top 1% owns over 30% of global wealth. Essentially, Piketty asserts that capital induces higher returns for those who own it because it doles out higher profits than wages, and wages rise significantly slower than the rate of capital. This leads to an issue of concentration. Few people have the capacity to own capital, and those who do often let their families inherit the wealth, propagating its flow only among a small proportion of the population. Thus, Piketty's findings suggest that the returns on capital grow faster than the growth rate of the economy, and that the growth rate will continue to be slower than the growth of capital. This is due to a variety of factors like an aging population and the persistence of free trade agreements. What is so disconcerting about Piketty's argument is that it argues against the fundamental moral underpinnings of capitalism, that is, that hard work pays off. When wages stagnate but wealth concentrates at the top, a large portion of society loses. Piketty asserts that the long-term prospects for inequality are dim at best, if not terrifying, should these trends continue. Thus, Piketty offers a few solutions to the problem in the final part of his book. To regulate capital, Piketty suggests a revamping of the social state, emphasizing spending on education and transfer payments. He then recommends a global, progressive, confiscatory income tax, and finally a global tax on capital wealth. The 2% global wealth tax would rake in billions of dollars and eliminate safe havens for wealth to be stored like Switzerland. The progressive income tax would eliminate excessive incomes and redistribute the money to the least well-off. And the modernized social state would eliminate wasteful programs and allow for greater upward social mobility. Under Piketty's framework, redistribution through taxation seems to be the only logical way to correct what he calls the central contradiction of R is greater than G. However, when evaluating Piketty's argument, it is clear to see the flaws in his thinking. His proposed solutions have garnered so much criticism for a reason. Not only do they seem neo-Marxist, his ideologically influenced conclusion failed to take into account a multitude of factors that contribute to inequality. First and foremost, his assumption that the rate of return on capital will continue to grow indefinitely fails to take into account the diminishing marginal rate of return. All capital deteriorates over time, and one could argue that modern capital depreciates even faster than before. For example, how often do we have to update our software or change out our computers just to keep up with the changing times? Advancements in technology and the effect of globalization could just as easily normalize the rate of substitution and therefore lessen the wealth accruing properties of capital. Secondly, his assumption that wealth will continue to concentrate comes from past data only. He does not describe a testable model to evaluate R is greater than G. He derives his solutions purely on an expectation that trends in the past will continue, and as we know, trends alone have little predictive power. Finally, his proposed solutions only evaluate one side of his equation, the capital side. He does not take into account what it might take to improve the rate of economic output or income growth, and instead opts to rely on redistribution only to undo the consequences of capitalism. As far as sustainable solutions go, his concept of taxes might be enough to stabilize growth rates in the short term, but if his ideas about capitalism are true, that is, that wealth always has a tendency to concentrate, then eventually a similar state will rise, regardless of taxation. If we look at his proposed policies individually, we can speculate that they might negatively affect growth prospects even more so than they would the rate of return on capital. As the Laffer curve describes, excessive taxation impedes growth, and the people who absorb the brunt of the punishment by downturns in growth and demand are often the least well off, precisely the people that Piketty wants to help the most. Not only would his taxes disincentivize growth, they would assuredly stifle wage growth. Finally, Piketty adopts a purely empirical approach to inequality, without respect to the political and social factors that contribute to and reinforce it. Much of what enables the wealthy 1% to maintain their fortunes is their ability to circumvent taxes and regulations. Regulatory capture, rent-seeking, and aggressive lobbying help maintain their poise atop the global economy. Similarly, issues like race, class, and their effect on access to resources and opportunity were largely ignored by Piketty. Now, all of these criticisms have been levied without respect to logistical viability and the wherewithal of every government to participate in such a plan. For this book to have any real policy consideration, one must look at how such interventions would be enacted. Corporations are indeed heavily taxed in the US and Europe. However, there is a tremendous difference between the nominal and the effective tax rate that many corporations pay. Now, I use corporations as an example because they are typically what owns the most in terms of capital and are responsible for a great portion of economic dealings. So who is to say that, even with such a magnitude of implementation, that any of these tax rates would be effective, or that all governments would necessarily uphold their end of the deal? It is difficult to believe that any third world government, for example, has the capacity to enforce these kinds of taxes, let alone an effective rule of law to meaningfully pass the necessary statutes. Thus, if we can neither trust corporations, businesses, or governments to pay and collect these global taxes, even if we assume that they are implemented, then how can Piketty's idealized world be sustainable? And how severe will the unintended consequences be? In other words, are any of Piketty's solutions truly worth the price of admission? With all that being said, we can reasonably conclude that, though Piketty's analysis is well-informed and certainly daunting, his solutions are based on faulty assumptions without respect to the multitude of factors that would affect their viability in achieving a goal of sustainable wealth redistribution. He overvalues the effects of redistribution and ignores the growth aspect of his own equation. Yet, despite the criticisms that I have described, there is still much to learn from Piketty's analysis, namely that something ought to be done about income and wealth inequality. Politicians have been rattling off these buzzwords for plenty of election cycles, but few have any legitimate solutions. Using Piketty's data, we might be able to find a common ground between growth and redistribution, perhaps even including what he has described in his book. And maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to put an end to what Piketty describes as his contradiction. Thank you for listening.